Rawlinson set his men 3 objectives.
First, he drew a green line on the map, 2 miles behind the first enemy line. He gave them 2 hours to reach it. There, they'd consolidate, and new forces would pass through them and fight their way through to the red line, which he marked 3 miles further on. And if by the end of the day they could then reach his blue line, they would have achieved an 8-mile advance altogether. It would be the biggest advance in one day's fighting of any Allied force on the Western Front since the war began.
In early August, Amiens was a ghost town. The population had been evacuated during the Ludendorff offensives. Now, the city was only 11 miles behind the front line, and no civilians had been allowed to return. The only people here were military, and there were more of them on their way. The troop build-up was hidden by a shroud of secrecy. The element of surprise was essential if the British plan was to succeed. Sand was even laid down on some of the deserted roads to deaden the sound of the troops and artillery massing in and around the city. And hundreds of tanks were hidden on the banks of the tree-lined canals. To make sure each soldier knew just how important it was to maintain secrecy, a small note was pasted into their pay books. It told them that if they were captured by the Germans, they were allowed to say their name, their serial number, and their rank, and nothing else. It ended with the words, "Keep your mouths shut."
A few days before the battle began, reports reached German commanders that unusual noise had been heard outside Amiens, perhaps signifying an Allied build-up. But Ludendorff discounted these reports. There is nothing, he said, to justify this apprehension, as long as our troops are vigilant and do their duty. Rawlinson's obsessive secrecy was paying off.
The early hours of August the 8th provided the perfect conditions for the launch of Rawlinson's elaborate plan. It was a moonless night, and from the river valleys, a ground mist provided valuable cover for the tanks rumbling into position.
This countryside was an anthill of activity as tens of thousands of Allied troops moved towards the front line. The men were under strict instructions. There was to be no shouting, no flashlights and no cigarettes, no unnecessary noise.
The silence played on our nerves a bit. As we got our guns into position, you could hear drivers whispering to their horses and men muttering curses under their breath. And still the silence persisted.
0 hour was set at 4:20 a.m., the hour before dawn. As it approached, all was silent. The moment British guns had opened fire on German positions, the British infantry had started their attack. The creeping barrage, which the advancing foot soldiers now hugged as closely as possible, was delivered by 700 heavy guns. At the same time, hundreds more guns concentrated on German strong points and artillery positions further back. For 17 miles along the front, flares lit up the countryside as a mass of troops and tanks moved forward under the barrage.
As the British, Canadian and Australian infantry advanced, the early morning fog was so thick they could only see about 10 yards in front of them. It was made even murkier by the smoke from the exploding artillery shells.
We were traveling fast. The sweat was rolling down my face. The shells were bursting everywhere, some of them very low. Machine gun bullets also whistled over us from the left flank, where the advance had been held up for a while.
Precisely as planned, the creeping barrage and the almost simultaneous infantry assault took the Germans totally by surprise. Some lead Allied units stormed into enemy trenches and bunkers and captured or killed the German defenders before they had any chance to organize a counterattack. At 6:30 a.m., this village of Marcel Cave became the target of the Canadian infantry, but they could make little headway against well-dug-in German machine guns. Then help appeared in the form of a lumbering Mark V British tank. Its commander, a lawyer from Somerset, sized up the situation and advanced into the village. Some of the German positions were blasted away by the tank's 6-pound guns. The rest were crushed under its tracks. It was all over in about half an hour, and the tank commander handed the village over to the Allied infantry, but not until, in typical lawyer-like fashion, he'd received a receipt. The village of Marcel Cave was now officially in Allied hands.
The taking of this village of Marcel Cave put the Canadians across Rawlinson's first objective, his Green Line.
British soldiers operating north of the River Somme had been given less distance to cover because they were fighting on rougher terrain. But about 3 hours into the battle, most of Rawlinson's units had reached their objectives. Now they could rest while new troops were pushed through to continue the attack.
By around 9 a.m., the fog was beginning to lift right the way across the wide battlefield, and Rawlinson was now able to employ his final weapon in his armory: aircraft. The Royal Air Force, barely a few months old, sent in 600 fighters and bombers to provide close air support to the Allied infantry. Phosphorus bombs were dropped ahead of the advancing tanks, and the planes strafed German ground targets like machine gun emplacements, which were much easier to spot from the air.